Hi, welcome to our channel, where we share the most amazing and unusual life stories. In each episode, you'll hear real events that might make you smile, think, get scared, or even be truly surprised. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Feel free to share your own life story in the comments, and we might include it in the next video. Story 1: Don't trust random companies. This happened last winter when I decided to spend the evening at a nightclub that had recently opened in our city. The place was trendy, and many friends recommended that I check it out. The atmosphere was amazing: music, lights, people smiling, all setting the tone for a great night. At some point, I met a group of people who seemed interesting and friendly. We talked a lot, joked around, and drank cocktails. Time flew by, and the evening seemed completely ordinary, until a moment I can't forget. I told my new acquaintances that I was going to the restroom, and they nodded casually. After being gone for a couple of minutes, I returned. Everything looked as usual, people chatting and dancing, but one thing surprised me: my glass was full, even though I distinctly remembered leaving it almost empty. I thought someone from the group had just refilled my drink, and without thinking much about it, I took a sip. About 15 minutes passed, maybe a little more. And then it started. Suddenly, everything around me became surreal. The lights were too bright, the music too loud, and the people too strange. Their faces began to blur, and words stopped making sense. I felt my head spinning, and fear gripped me. Every movement was difficult. I tried to say something, but my tongue wouldn't cooperate. With every passing minute, the world around me became more distorted, as if I was trapped in a nightmare. Panic was setting in, and I felt like I was losing control of my body and mind. At that moment, I realized something was wrong, but I was too weak to do anything about it. Someone from the group offered to walk me to the exit, and in my disoriented state, I agreed. How we got outside and how I made it home is all a blur. It was only the next day, waking up with a pounding headache and hazy memories, that I realized something had happened. I still don't know what was in that glass or who might have spiked it, but that evening was a lesson for me. Now, I'm much more careful about the company I keep and where I spend my time. Story 2: Preserve the memory. This spring, my girlfriend and I decided to visit her grandmother, who lived in a small village. The old house, surrounded by fields and forests, stood on the very edge of the village. It was always quiet and peaceful there, and we hoped to escape the city's hustle and bustle. Grandma greeted us warmly, and our days were filled with endless conversations, tea with jam, and walks around the area. But as often happens when something seems too perfect, something unexpected happens. On the third night, we decided to go to bed early. The fresh country air and long walks had taken their toll. We lay in bed, and it was immediately apparent how dark and quiet it was. The only source of light was a faint moonbeam filtering through the thick curtains. I was almost asleep when I suddenly felt that something had changed in the room's atmosphere. At first, I thought it was just the wind outside the window, but the sound was different, like someone whispering right outside our door. I froze, trying to catch anything, but nothing happened. However, a sense of unease had already taken root in my mind. A few minutes later, it happened again: a whisper, then a sound like the creak of an old floorboard. I opened my eyes and saw that my girlfriend was also lying there with her eyes open, listening intently. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. She just nodded, and I noticed how her eyes glistened with fear in the dim light. We both lay there silently, unsure of what to do, until we heard a distinct knock, as if someone gently tapped on our door. My heart raced, and I slowly got out of bed, trying not to make a sound. I approached the door and stood still, listening. Again, a knock 3 times, slow and insistent. I decided to open the door, but there was no one there. The darkness of the hallway was eerily infinite, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Returning to the room, I locked the door, though I knew it probably wouldn't help. We tried to sleep, but every noise in the house made us jump. At some point, I heard something moving in the attic. It might have been the wind or rats, but the sound was so clear and rhythmic that there was no doubt someone or something was moving up there. Gathering my courage, I took a flashlight and slowly climbed to the attic. The stairs creaked under my feet, and my heart was about to leap out of my chest. But when I opened the hatch and lit up the space in front of me, I saw only empty walls, dust, and cobwebs. But in the far corner of the attic, on the old wooden floor, lay an old doll, the very one Grandma had told me about the night before. She said the doll had belonged to her mother and had always been in the house. When Grandma was little, she often played with it, but as she grew older, the doll began to frighten her, and she hid it in the attic. I picked up the doll, and at that moment it seemed to get a little heavier, as if something was inside it. Frightened, I quickly put it back and returned to the room, trying not to think about what had just happened. That night, we never managed to sleep. In the morning, discussing what had happened with Grandma, she just smiled and said that perhaps her mother decided to check on the guests in her house. Since then, I've started to believe more in the stories of the elderly and in the idea that old things can hold more than just memories. Story 3, it's time to believe in superstitions. It was an ordinary evening when I finally decided to take out the trash. The yard was almost empty, and only the street lights dimly lit the sidewalk in front of the building. I was leisurely walking towards the dumpster, thinking about my own affairs, when suddenly, out of nowhere, a black cat darted in front of me. It swiftly crossed my path, stopped for a moment, looked me straight in the eyes, and then disappeared into the shadows. I had never believed in superstitions, so I just shrugged it off and continued on my way. Who pays attention to such things nowadays? I threw out the trash, returned home, and everything seemed normal. But as soon as I crossed the threshold of my apartment, I noticed that something had changed. The first thing I noticed was a strange smell. It wasn't the familiar scent of my home, it was something sharp and unpleasant. I walked through all the rooms trying to find the source, but found nothing. The smell seemed to come from everywhere, and nowhere at the same time. My mood immediately dropped. I tried turning on the TV to distract myself, but it only buzzed, not showing a single channel. All my attempts to fix it led to nothing. The device simply refused to work. I decided to take a shower to calm down, but then I encountered a new shock. When I turned on the water, it was icy cold, even though I knew for sure that the water heater was on. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to warm up under the cold streams, when I noticed that the bathroom mirror started to fog up, but strange patterns began to appear on it, as if someone had run their fingers over it. These weren't just random lines, they formed symbols I had never seen before. I began to feel fear slowly creeping up inside me. Deciding not to stay in the bathroom, I returned to the living room and tried to call friends to distract myself from these strange occurrences, but my phone was dead, even though it had been fully charged that morning. The evening was turning into a real battle with the unexplained. I sat on the couch, and suddenly, the lights throughout the apartment flickered. The bulbs began to dim until they went out completely. Only a faint glow from the streetlight outside filtered through the window, casting eerie shadows in the room. Amidst all this, I suddenly heard a barely audible sound, like a whisper. It came from somewhere in the corner of the room, gradually growing louder. My heart began to race when I realized that the whisper wasn't just noise. It was as if someone was trying to say something, but the words were unintelligible and menacing. Unable to bear it any longer, I rushed to the front door, opened it, and fled to the stairwell. As soon as I was outside the apartment, everything went quiet. My mind was on edge, and I realized that it all started with that black cat. I didn't dare return home that evening. I spent the night at a friend's place, thinking about how maybe there really was something to these superstitions. The next day, before going back home, I bought candles at a church and decided to do everything I could to avoid encountering such unexplained phenomena again. Now, whenever a black cat crosses my path, I don't just walk on by. Sometimes it's better to be cautious than to face something that defies logic again. Story 4. A funny incident at the zoo. It was one of those beautiful days when I decided to spend some time outdoors and went to the zoo. Everything was going as usual. I walked along the paths, looked at the animals, enjoyed the light breeze and the sounds of nature. The zoo was full of children and families. Everyone was smiling and having a good time, and I was thinking about how nice it was to finally take a break from the hustle and bustle of the city. When I reached the squirrel enclosure, I stopped to watch them skillfully jump from branch to branch. These little creatures always made me smile. They were so quick, clever, and had fluffy tails. Suddenly, one of the squirrels darted off a branch and, without hesitation, headed straight toward me. Before I could blink, this little creature was already sitting on my shoulder. Naturally, I was slightly surprised, but even more so when the squirrel began to climb higher and eventually ended up on my head. People around me started to giggle, and I just stood there, not knowing what to do. But it didn't stop there. The squirrel began to rummage through my hair as if it had found the perfect place to bury its nuts. I could feel its tiny paws deftly combing through my hair, trying to hide its treasure as deeply as possible. Trying not to move so as not to scare off this fluffy wonder, I caught the amused gazes of people who were smiling and laughing as they watched the scene unfold. A few minutes passed, which felt like an eternity. The squirrel finally, seemingly satisfied with its work, jumped off my head and ran back to the enclosure, leaving me standing in the middle of the zoo with nuts buried in my hair. Looking around, I saw that people who had witnessed the episode couldn't hold back their laughter, and children were pointing at me, joyfully shouting, "Look, he has nuts on his head." Trying to maintain my dignity, I carefully pulled the nuts out of my hair, handing them out as souvenirs to my friends, who had by then arrived and were barely holding back their laughter as they tried to support me. Now, when I recall that day, I can't help but smile. Who would have thought that a simple trip to the zoo would turn into such a funny adventure? Since then, I try to keep my distance from squirrel enclosures, but every time I see a squirrel, I can't help but feel a bit of joy, remembering how one of them decided to set up a storage right on my head. Story 5: A job search that taught Maine a life lesson. This happened a few years ago when I was looking for a job and came across an attractive offer. The job was unofficial, but the conditions seemed appealing: good money, a flexible schedule, and easy tasks. I thought it was the perfect opportunity to make some quick cash without giving much thought to the consequences. The first day went smoothly. The tasks were simple, the team was friendly, and I thought I had found the ideal place. In the following days, I began to notice some oddities. The management kept changing, the tasks became more confusing, and the atmosphere within the team grew tense. One day, when I arrived at work, I was assigned to do something that was beyond my job description. I didn't think much of it and completed the task as requested. However, it later turned out that the task was far from harmless. My mistake caused serious problems for the company, and instead of supporting me, the management simply shifted all the responsibility onto my shoulders. Threats started coming in, saying that if I didn't compensate for the damage, I would face serious trouble. Since I was not officially listed as an employee of the company, there was no one to protect my rights. At that moment, I realized the trap I had fallen into. Everything that seemed so simple and convenient had turned against me. As I tried to sort out the situation, I understood that unofficial work can not only fail to meet expectations, but also cause serious harm. Without a contract, a labor agreement, or any guarantees, I was completely defenseless against the employer. In the end, I had to leave, losing money, time, and peace of mind. This experience became an important lesson for me. No amount of money is worth risking your reputation and safety. Working without official paperwork is always a risk that can lead to very unpleasant consequences. Since then, I always check how reliable a company is before agreeing to work for them, and I never accept offers that aren't backed by legal documents. Now I understand how crucial it is to protect your rights and always think a step ahead to avoid ending up in a difficult situation like the one I experienced back then.